I want to be clear about one thing before I tell you any of this. I am not a remarkable man. I know people hear a story like mine and they want to remake you in the telling of it. They want you to be the kind of person who saw the moment coming, who understood, somewhere in the back of his chest, that the boy at the window needed exactly what he had to give, and who moved toward that need with the quiet deliberateness of a man who knows his purpose. That's not what happened. What happened is that I went to work. I dug holes and turned soil and patched irrigation lines, and I did not understand a single thing about what was unfolding around me until it was already done. My name is Davin Orell. I am 44 years old. I have a daughter named Kala who lives with my sister on Thurath Station, and who calls me every third Sunday. And I have been the head groundskeeper of the Vithil Imperial Residence on the planet Vithos for 2 years and a season now. Before that I was the Outer Grounds crew chief on a terraforming contract in the Kethal system for 6 years, and before that I was a lot of things: a younger man, a husband, a father who was home more, but this story isn't about most of that. This story is about one autumn on Vithos, and a boy who wouldn't speak, and a trowel. I will do my best to tell it honestly. Vithos is a cold planet by my standards, though the Vithos people don't seem to notice. The air tastes faintly of copper, and the sky runs to pale violet in the mornings before it settles into a gray blue that I have come, over time, to find beautiful. The palace grounds are extraordinary: 3 kilometers of terrace gardens that step down from the residence walls to the valley floor, planted with species I couldn't name for the first 6 months and have only partly catalogued since. The Vithos grow things the way they do everything else, with elaborate protocol and a deep reluctance to explain any of it to outsiders. I was hired through the Bureau of External Labor, which is the Vithos government's rather grand name for the office that processes work permits for non-Vithos workers. They needed someone who could manage a human crew. There were 9 of us, all Terran or Thurath-born, and who had enough horticultural experience to supervise the outer grounds without troubling the palace's own senior gardeners, who were Vithos and deeply protective of the inner terraces. I was the right hire: experienced, quiet, willing to work without much supervision, and sufficiently ignorant of Vithos court politics to stay out of things that weren't my concern. That last quality turned out to matter more than I expected. The palace itself I rarely entered. My domain was everything outside the inner walls: the lower terraces, the approach gardens, the maintenance paths between the drainage channels and the hedgerow borders that separated the residence grounds from the valley. I had an office, a generous word for a stone shed with a rusted exhaust fan and a folding desk, near the southwest service gate, and I kept my crew's schedule pinned to the door with a piece of wire, and that was the full extent of my administrative life. I was outside from first light until the light gave out. I liked it that way. The inner residence was the business of the inner residence staff, and I made it a policy not to look too long at things that weren't my business. This is a discipline I developed over years of working in places where I was a guest, technically speaking, a Terran on a Kethal station, a human on a Vithos contract, and it has served me well. You learn to keep your eyes at the right height. Not down, because that reads as shame and invites a particular kind of condescension. Not up, because that reads as ambition and makes people nervous. Straight ahead at the work in front of you. It's a navigable altitude. So I noticed the boy in the window the way I noticed most things, peripherally, without making a production of it. He was there the second week of autumn, the first time I saw him. 3rd window from the left on the nursery level, 2nd floor of the east wing. The windows were tall and narrow. All Vithos architecture runs to height and compression, as though the buildings are trying to make themselves look taller than the mountains, and the glass was the particular shade of pale blue that Vithos glaziers favor, which meant that on most days the windows were nearly opaque from the outside. But in the low morning light, when the sun came in at an angle from behind the ridgeline, the glass went briefly clear, and that's when I saw him. Small, perhaps 6 or 7 years old by my estimation, though I am not always accurate with Vitho's children's ages. They mature at a different pace than human children, and their faces don't carry age the same way ours do. He had the pale silver-blue skin common to Vithos of the high lineages and very large dark eyes, and his hair was white and fine, and he pressed his small hands flat against the glass as though checking whether it was cold. He was watching me work. I was laying drainage pipe along the border of the third lower terrace that morning, not glamorous work, involving a lot of crouching and some inventive language when the pipe joints didn't cooperate, and I became aware at some point that the boy had not moved, just standing there, hands on the glass. I did not wave. I did not look up and meet his eyes and smile the warm, obvious smile of a person who has noticed he is being observed. I just worked. He was there again the next morning, and the morning after that. After about a week I mentioned it, carefully, to Sella Vorn, who was the junior liaison assigned to my crew, a young Vithos woman from the palace administrative staff, who served as our primary contact for anything involving the residence itself. I mentioned it the way I might mention that one of the drainage channels was running slow, as a fact, not a concern, offered in case it was useful. Sella's face did the thing that Vithos faces do when they are trying very hard not to show something. The expressions are different from human ones. The tells are in the eyes and the set of the shoulders rather than the mouth. But I had been working alongside Vithos people long enough to read the basics. "That is Prince Son," she said, "the Emperor's son." I nodded. "He has been," she stopped, chose another word. "He does not go outside much." I nodded again and did not ask why, because it was not my business, and Sella looked grateful for that in the specific, compressed way of someone who has had to answer this question many times from people who had less restraint than I did. I went back to my drainage pipe. It was Petra, one of my crew, who told me the rest of it. Petra had been on Vithos longer than any of us, nearly 4 years, working first for a private estate before picking up the palace contract, and she had cultivated, through some combination of charm and persistence, a network of palace kitchen staff who kept her informed of more than she strictly needed to know. "The Empress died last winter," Petra said. She was eating her midday meal on the low stone wall that bordered the fourth terrace, and she said it in the same tone she used for everything matter of fact without dramatizing. "Fever. It went fast. The boy was with her at the end." She pulled apart a section of flatbread. "He hasn't said a word since, not one. They brought in 3 different grief specialists, 2 Vithos, one from the Oran Collective, palace physicians, a healer from the Tivith Monastery. None of them got anywhere." I thought about the small hands pressed flat against the glass. "How long?" I said. 8 months. I finished my meal and went back to work. I want to be precise about what I did not do next because I think it matters. I did not conceive a plan. I did not say to myself, "I know how to reach this child because I have lost someone too, and grief recognizes grief." I did not think about my wife Marin, who died 3 years ago of a sudden cardiac event on Thurath Station while I was 6 weeks out on a Kethal survey crew, or about Kala, who was 14 then and is 17 now, and who got through it mostly by not needing me to help her, which I was grateful for because I was not sure I was capable of helping anyone that year. I did not map my own experience onto the boy in the window, and decide that what I had survived gave me some particular insight into what he needed. I just noticed him, and I kept showing up. That's the honest version. The gate was left unlatched on the 42nd morning. I don't know whether it was accident or intention. The nursery wing had a small private courtyard, more a terrace, really, tucked between the east wall and a section of ornamental hedgerow that had been connected at some point to my jurisdiction, technically, though I had never been asked to do anything with it. It was the sort of space that falls between people's remits, too small to be the inner gardener's concern, not quite outside enough to be mine. The plantings were original Vithos formal work, very old, and they had been left on their own long enough to go slightly to seed. Not ruined, just unkempt. The gate between my lower terrace path and this courtyard had been closed, and latched every day for as long as I had been on the grounds. On the 42nd morning, it was standing open about a hand's width. I looked at it for a moment. Then I picked up the tray of root divisions I had been moving, and I walked through the gate and into the courtyard, and I set the tray down near the southern bed, and I started working on the edge that had gone ragged. About 20 minutes later, I heard footsteps. Small, careful, the particular sound of a child who has learned to move quietly. I did not turn around. I continued working. I was using a short-handled edging tool along the bed border, and the work made a soft, rhythmic sound against the soil, and I concentrated on keeping that rhythm even. Unhurried. Nothing alarming about it. Just a man doing a job. He stood behind me for a while. I counted by the rhythm of the edging tool, perhaps 5 minutes. Then I heard him sit down, a very small, careful sound of fabric and knees finding the ground. I still did not turn around. I kept working. At some point, I can't say how long, the morning light had moved and the copper smell in the air had sharpened toward midday. I reached sideways into my tool bag without looking at him, and I found the second edging trowel I keep in the outer pocket. I set it on the ground between us. Silence. I kept working. After another while, I heard him pick it up. I did not say anything. He did not say anything. We worked side by side along the bed border, him slightly less precisely than me, but with a genuine attention to it, the way children bring to physical tasks when they have decided to take them seriously, for the better part of an hour. Then I heard his footsteps retreat, quiet, unhurried. The sound of someone leaving because they chose to, not because they were summoned. I packed up my tools, latched the gate behind me, and wrote in my sight log, "Nursery courtyard east bed. Edging and border repair begun. Will continue." I did not write anything else. He came back the next morning. I made sure to be in the courtyard by first light, working on the south bed. The gate was open again. I had left it so, before I left the night before, thinking that if someone latched it, that was that, and I would find another reason to be nearby. And if no one latched it, then the boy could find his way back without anyone having to make it into a thing. No one had latched it. He appeared at the same time, within a few minutes of when he had appeared the day before. Small, careful footsteps, a silence, then the quiet sound of him settling near me on the ground. I passed him the trowel without looking. He took it without saying anything. On the third day I brought seeds. This was not a calculated gesture. I was planting a section of Vitho's winter ground cover along the path borders, the kind of work that goes faster with 2 pairs of hands, even if one of the pairs is small and belongs to someone who has never done it before, and it seemed reasonable to have the seeds with me. I showed him, without speaking, what to do. Poke a small hole with your finger, depth of the first knuckle, drop 1 seed, cover it over, move a hand's width along. He watched. Then he did it. He was methodical, more methodical than most adults I have worked alongside, honestly. He did not rush. He did not get ahead of himself and start the next hole before the previous one was fully covered. He worked at the pace I had shown him, and he held to that pace even when I moved to a different section, and he was working by himself. I noticed at some point that I had started talking. Not to him exactly. I do this when I work alone. I narrate quietly to no one, the names of things, what I'm doing and why. It's a habit I picked up on long survey contracts, when you go days without adult conversation, and the sound of your own voice in a familiar cadence becomes a kind of anchor. I wasn't performing it for the boy. It just started happening because he was there and the work was ongoing and the talking was part of the working. "This one's a border plant," I said, to the soil or the seeds or myself. "Stays low. The roots go wide instead of deep. That's how it holds a slope. On Thureth they grow something similar along the terraces, but it's red, not blue. My daughter used to call it carpetweed because it looks like someone rolled a rug out on the hillside. I pressed soil over a seed. She was about your age when she said that. Silence, the sound of a small trowel, precise and patient. She's older now, I said. Teenagers think carpetweed is too simple. She is interested in things that are more complicated. I paused. I can't blame her. We worked until midday. The days built on each other with the specific, undramatic rhythm of real things. Morning, I was in the courtyard by first light. The gate was open. He came within a quarter hour of dawn, quiet and unhurried. We worked. I talked to the seeds and the soil and the occasional stubborn root, and sometimes, if something in the work caught a thought, I said it out loud without making it a question or an invitation, just a statement released into the air between us. He never answered, but he listened. I could tell, the way you can tell when someone in a room is paying attention to what you are saying versus simply being present in the same space as sound. His attention had a quality to it, a weight. In the afternoons, I went back to the lower terraces and my crew and the regular work of the grounds. My crew knew I was spending time in the nursery courtyard. Petra knew more than that, because Petra always knew more than that, but she had the sense to let me alone about it. She mentioned once, looking at a section of the site log, that I had put in 2 extra hours a day on the courtyard work without billing them to the contract. I said I was aware of that. The courtyard doesn't pay, she said. I know, I said. She looked at me for a moment, then she went back to her own work. I was not doing it for the money. I was not doing it for anything exactly. The courtyard needed work and the boy needed. I did not know what the boy needed. But he kept coming and the gate kept being open, and every morning when I arrived I felt something that I can only describe as relief. That the gate was still open, that the latch had not been turned, that whatever was happening here had not been stopped. I have thought about this since, and I think the relief was simpler than I made it at the time. I was a man who had not been able to be present when it mattered most, not there when Marin died, not there enough in the years before that, 6 weeks away on survey contracts while my daughter learned to do without my company. And here was a small person who was asking, in the only way available to him, for someone to be present. Just present. No expertise required. No certification in grief counseling or child development or Vithos pediatric psychology. Just come back, keep coming back, do the work. I could do that. That was something I actually knew how to do. I had learned the hard way that presence is not the same thing as being in the room. You can be in the same house as someone you love and be entirely absent, living inside the logistics of the next contract, or the mental arithmetic of the budget, or the low-grade worry that never quite lifts when you are the person responsible for keeping things operational. Marin used to say that I was the most reliable person she had ever met, and also, sometimes, the most difficult person to find. She didn't mean it unkindly. She meant it accurately. There is a particular kind of person, and I am one of them, who defaults to the management of situations when what is actually being called for is simply the full weight of their attention, their eyes, their unhurried time. Grief had taught me that the management of situations has limits. A cardiac event at 51 on Thurath Station cannot be managed. A 14-year-old who has just lost her mother cannot be managed into grief's end point. There is only the showing up, the sitting beside, the handing over of whatever small tool is in your hand and waiting to see whether it is accepted. It was accepted. Every morning it was accepted. On the 19th day, he said a word. I was transplanting a section of what I had come to think of as the white stem bed, a cluster of Vithos perennials that had spread beyond their original border and needed thinning, and I had unearthed a grub, pale, curved, about the length of my thumb, alive and extremely indignant about being displaced. It writhed in my palm in the methodical, indifferent way of creatures that have no understanding of situations and react only to conditions. I held it out, not quite toward the boy, not quite away, just held it at a neutral angle in case he wanted to look. He looked. The grub did what grubs do. It curled tighter, then uncurled, then curled again. A very small drama. The boy said, "Does it hurt?" That was all. 2 words, 3 in vithos, because vithos doesn't compress the way standard does, and the question came out in the careful, slightly formal vithos of a child who has been taught to speak well, and has not spoken in 8 months, and has therefore not had the chance to get careless about it. His voice was higher than I expected and very careful, as though he were testing whether the mechanism still worked. I looked at the grub. "No," I said, "I don't think so. The way it moves, that's more confusion than pain. It doesn't know what soil it's in. It just knows it was in one kind and now it's in another." He considered this. "Will you put it back?" "I'll find it a new place," I said. "The old spot is going to be disturbed, but there are good spots in the south corner, deeper soil, more moisture, better for it probably than where it was." He watched me carry the grub to the south corner and settle it into a hole I dug with 2 fingers. I covered it over. The boy was quiet for a moment. "My mother," he said, and then stopped. I waited. I did not fill the silence. This is perhaps the only thing I can claim to have done deliberately. I did not rush to fill the silence. I have sat with grieving people who needed the silence more than they needed anything I could say. And I know that the instinct to speak, to ease your own discomfort at the weight of another person's pause, is almost always about you and not about them. He did not finish the sentence, but he had started it, and he stayed for another hour, working quietly beside me, and when he left he walked a little differently than he had walked before, a little less carefully, a little more like someone who has put something down and found they can move more freely without it. After that he talked. Not always, not every day. But the silence had cracked, and what came through was a child. A regular child in the way that children are regular, curious, random, prone to non sequiturs, possessed of opinions about things that mattered to no one else and very firm opinions at that. He told me about the variety of beetles that lived in the palace inner walls and the ranking system he had devised for them, starting from least to most interesting. He told me about a book of Vithos botany from the palace library that he had been reading, in which several of the plants in our courtyard were described as extinct, which he found puzzling since they were clearly not extinct and were in fact at that moment growing at his feet. He told me about the nanny before the last nanny, who had been kinder than the last nanny but had not lasted, because she kept sneezing at the whitestem plants. He had, I learned, a considerable internal life that had simply had nowhere to go for 8 months. It came out now in the way that water comes out when you remove a blockage, not in a rush exactly, but with the quiet relief of movement restored. He had observations about everything. He noticed, for instance, that I cleaned my tools in a specific order at the end of each session, and he wanted to know whether there was a reason for the order or whether it was merely habit, and when I thought about it, I realized it was habit with a reason buried inside it. The larger tools first, so the small tools don't get missed. The cutting tools last, because they need the most care and you are most likely to be thorough if you haven't yet had to do the others. He listened to this explanation with the concentration he brought to all explanations, and then said that this was similar to the order in which his tutors assigned the day's lessons. Largest subjects first, so the mind was sharp for them, smallest last. I said I had not thought of it that way. He seemed satisfied by this, as though the universe had demonstrated a consistency he had suspected. He also asked questions that did not have good answers, and he seemed to appreciate that I said so rather than manufacturing something that sounded like an answer. How long do the whitestem plants live? Genuinely unknown. The botany book dated them to the early palace period, which would make the oldest specimens several hundred years old, but there was no way to verify this without core sampling that I was not going to do. Why does clay compact but sand doesn't? I gave him the simplified version, which was about particle shape and how flat particles stack differently than round ones. And he said that this was the simplified version and he wanted to know more. And I said I did not have more than the simplified version and we could look it up together in the botany book. He considered this acceptable. He did not talk about his mother again, not directly, but sometimes, working in a section we had cleared and replanted, he would look at what was growing and say something like, "She would have liked this color," and then move on without waiting for a response. And I would nod, and that seemed to be sufficient. The acknowledgement was enough. He didn't need me to say anything about the Empress. He just needed someone to receive the sentence and not flinch from it. I told him about Kala, occasionally. Not as a lesson or a parallel. I was careful not to construct a meaningful comparison between a boy who had lost his mother and a man who had lost his wife, because they are not the same thing, and it would have been condescending to suggest that they were, and the boy was bright enough that he would have noticed the condescension. I just told him the stories. Kala's campaign, at age 7, to convince me that a ground-dwelling lizard from the Thurath Plains could be kept as a house pet, which had ended in the lizard's dignified departure through the kitchen window. Kala's discovery of my site logs from the Kethal contract, which she had read in full at age 12 and pronounced deeply boring, a verdict with which I could not disagree. The Sunday calls, and how she always asked about the weather on whatever planet I was working, as though the specific temperature of the air around me was the one fact that oriented her, confirmed that I was somewhere real. He liked the Kala stories. He had, I learned, no siblings, and the way he listened to those stories, with the particular attention of an only child hearing about the texture of sibling-adjacent life, told me something about what he was hungry for. I did not say this out loud. We planted a great deal together over those weeks. I want to tell you about the planting because I think it is the point of the story, more than anything that came after. The after part is what people want to hear, I understand that, and I will tell it, but the planting is where everything actually happened. Vitho's soil in the nursery courtyard is a deep gray-brown, heavier than Thurath loam and with a particular clay content that makes it work differently under a trowel. It takes longer to warm in the morning, holds moisture longer after rain, and tends to compact around plant roots if you don't aerate it regularly. I taught the boy to check for compaction by pressing a thumb into the soil at a standard depth and feeling the resistance. A loose soil takes the thumb easily, a compacted one pushes back. He would do this test at several points around a plant before reporting his findings to me, with the gravity of someone delivering official measurements. "This one is medium," he would say. "This one is hard. This one is..." A pause while he pressed the thumb in and concentrated, almost soft. "Good," I would say, and we would decide together which ones needed aerating. He learned over those weeks how to hold a trowel so your wrist doesn't ache after an hour, the difference between a root ball that is healthy and ready to be moved and one that is stressed and needs more time, how to water a newly transplanted seedling so that the water goes to the roots rather than running off the surface, how to read the way a plant is leaning to figure out which direction its light is coming from, how to recognize the beginning of a nitrogen deficiency by the color of the oldest leaves. I don't know whether he has used any of this since, but he learned it seriously and thoroughly, the way children learn things when they have decided to actually learn them rather than simply satisfy an adult's expectation of performance. And I think there is something important in that, in the act of learning a physical thing when you are lost inside yourself. Your hands know what they are doing even when the rest of you doesn't. The soil gives back a specific and reliable kind of response to the work you do in it. Things grow or they don't, and when they grow you can see exactly why, and when they don't you can usually figure that out too. It is a world with rules that hold. I have found that very useful in the years when other rules were not holding. I think he found it useful too. There was one morning, deep in the 4th week, the clay beds at their autumn heaviest, when a transplanted seedling he had moved the day before had gone over. leaning badly to one side, roots not yet settled, pulled by its own weight and the clay's reluctance to grip it. He arrived and saw it and went still in the way he went still when something troubled him. He stood looking at it for a long time without saying anything. "It needs to go back in," I said. "Deeper this time. The clay wasn't packed close enough around the root ball." He crouched down and looked at it from the level of the soil, assessing it the way I had shown him, not from above but from beside, where you can see the lean and judge the angle and understand what the plant is doing rather than simply observe that something has gone wrong. "I didn't pack it properly," he said. "No," I said, "neither do I sometimes. You learn the feel of it." He dug it out with care, and this was something I noticed, that he was always careful with the root systems, never hasty, the way some gardeners are, tearing roots in their impatience, and he replanted it, pressing the clay methodically around the root ball in the 3 stages I had shown him. Outer zone first, middle, then close. Then he firmed it from above with both palms, even pressure. He stood back and looked at it. "Better," I said. He looked at it for another moment. Then something settled in his face, some small private reckoning completed. "It will have to work harder now," he said, "to grow straight." "Yes," I said, "but it can." He nodded once and picked up his trowel and moved on to the next section. And I thought, as I sometimes did in those weeks, about how much a child will tell you when you are not quite looking at him, about what he is carrying and what he is beginning, carefully and with both hands, to set down. 6 weeks in, Sella Vorn appeared at the outer gate of the courtyard. I was the only one there at that point. The boy had left an hour before, as he always did when midday approached, retreating back inside with the same quiet self-possession with which he arrived, and I was bundling cuttings for composting. Sella stood at the gate and looked at the courtyard for a moment before she spoke. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I would like an honest answer." "All right," I said. "Are you aware that what you have been doing here is," she chose the word carefully, "irregular?" "I imagine it is," I said. "Do you need me to stop?" She was quiet for a moment. In Avitho's face, the equivalent of a long breath. "The head physician spoke to me this morning," she said. "He wanted to know who had been with the prince in the courtyard." A pause. "The prince spoke to him yesterday, for the first time in 8 months." I nodded. "He asked the physician," Sella continued carefully, "whether grubs feel pain." I put down the bundle of cuttings. "The physician did not know the answer," Sella said. "He came to ask if we had any horticultural literature that addressed invertebrate sensitivity." I looked at her. "He is a very thorough man," she said. "He wanted to give the prince an accurate answer." I did not say anything for a moment. There was a quality to this information that I needed to sit with before responding to it. "Sella," I said. "Yes. I am not a therapist. I don't have any qualifications in child development or grief counseling or anything of that nature. I'm a groundskeeper. I have spent the last 6 weeks doing grounds work in a courtyard that needed grounds work, and a child happened to come and sit beside me while I did it." "Yes," she said. "I don't want to overstate what I did." "I understand." She was looking at me with an expression that I could not entirely read, not quite warmth, not quite something more official. "Davin, nobody is asking you to overstate anything." "What are they asking?" She considered this. "For now, they are asking me to confirm that the gate should remain as it is." I picked up the bundle of cuttings. "It can remain as it is," I said. There was an afternoon, I think it was the 8th week, well into the deep autumn now, when the Vithos sky ran to heavy steel blue by midday, and the courtyard plants had gone into their winter dormancy, when we were not working. This happened sometimes. The boy would arrive and there was nothing pressing to be done. The beds were in good order, and he would simply sit on the low border wall, and I would sit on an upturned planting crate, and we would be in the same space without the organizing structure of work. He was quiet that day for a long time. Then he said, "Do you miss her?" He said her without explaining who he meant, and I understood that he was not talking about his mother. He was asking about Marin. I had mentioned her once briefly in the context of the Thureth carpetweed story, had said my wife used to say, and then corrected to the past tense without explanation, and he had noticed. "Yes," I said. He was quiet again. His feet were too short to reach the ground from the wall, and he swung them slightly, a small, unconscious motion. "Does it become smaller?" he said. I thought about this honestly, because he was asking honestly and deserved that in return. "It doesn't become smaller," I said. "It becomes less present sometimes. There are days when it's further back. But it doesn't shrink. It stays the same size. You just get bigger around it." He swung his feet. "That seems very slow," he said. "It is," I said. "It is the slowest thing I know of." He nodded with the particular gravity of a child who has decided that an adult has told him the truth. And then we sat there together for a while longer, him swinging his feet and me on the planting crate, looking at the dormant beds in the winter light, not saying anything more. That was, I think, the real moment. Not anything that came after. Just that afternoon, two people in a garden, one of them very small, both of them doing the slow work. I found out about the emperor the way I found out about most things involving the palace, from Petra, and slightly after the fact. "He's been watching," she said. We were doing end-of-autumn inventory on the tool storage shed, and she said it with the same absence of ceremony she brought to everything. "Who has?" "The Emperor Tivos." She held up a pruning saw and examined it for rust. "The arch on the east side of the courtyard, the one with the climbing plant, what do you call it?" "The gray tendril vine." "That one, he can see through it. He's been there 3 times that I know of." She put the saw down. "The kitchen staff see him cross the east corridor in the morning sometimes, early." I sat with this for a moment. "How long?" "A few weeks, maybe more." She picked up another tool. "He doesn't want anyone to do anything about it. He told the house steward to leave it alone." I thought about the gray tendril vine, which was thick and established and grew in an intricate screen over the east arch. It would, from the inside of the arch, give you an almost complete view of the courtyard while hiding you almost completely from anyone in it. I thought about how long it had taken me to recognize that the arch was there. I walked past it most mornings, and had catalogued it as an architectural feature without particularly attending to it. I thought about a father watching his son speak to a groundskeeper about whether grubs feel pain. I went back to the inventory and did not say anything else. He called me Dad on the 53rd day. I want to be careful here, because this is the part that people fix on, the part that becomes the whole story when it gets told in shorthand. And it was, in reality, both exactly what you would imagine and also very unlike anything I might have imagined. We were planting winter bulbs, specific variety of Vithos bulb, pale-shelled, that go in deep in autumn and come up in early spring as small white flowers. He had found them in the botany book, identified them as something the courtyard had once had and no longer did, and asked if we could try to plant some. I had located a source through the palace supply registry, and they had arrived that morning in a cloth bag, and we were working through the bed systematically. Measured spacing, correct depth, oriented with the root end down. He was a little ahead of me. He had gotten faster over the weeks, more confident in the tool, and he had planted 4 bulbs while I was still on my second. I said, without looking up from the hole I was digging, "Don't get too far ahead. If you plant them too close to the end of the bed, we'll have to come back and move them when we put in the edging." And he said simply, without apparent awareness of doing anything unusual, "All right, Dad." And then continued planting. I stopped. I held still for a moment, the trowel in my hand, the pale autumn light on the beds, The sound of the boy planting bulbs, methodical, unhurried. I had a daughter, Calla, who was 17, who called me every third Sunday, who had not called me dad in the habitual, offhand way, the way you use a word that has worn smooth from use, since she was perhaps 12. The word had weight in my chest in a way I was not prepared for. I started digging again. I did not say anything. I did not make it into a moment, because the boy had not meant it as a moment. He had said it the way you say the name of a thing when the name fits, without thinking about it, the way you say the trowel or the south corner or the gray tendril vine. It had fit, and so he had said it, and if I made a thing of it I would make it strange and self-conscious and he would stop saying it, and I did not want him to stop. We planted the rest of the bulbs. At the end of the session, before he went inside, he paused at the edge of the courtyard and looked back at the newly planted bed. "They'll be white," he said, "when they come up." "That's right. I want to see them," he said, "when they come up." "They'll be up in early spring," I said. "I'll be here." He nodded once and went inside. There is a thing that happens when you have been working in a place long enough. You stop noticing the constant negotiations of being a guest. The thousand small calibrations, the altitude of your gaze, the careful proportion of your space, the management of how much of yourself you bring into a room that isn't yours, these stop costing anything. You are simply there doing the work, and the work is the fact that anchors you to the place. I had reached that point on Vithos, sometime in the second year. The outer grounds felt like mine in the way that any workplace feels like yours if you have tended it long enough, not owned, not claimed, but familiar in the cellular way, the way your body knows the steps of a space before your mind registers walking. And then there was the courtyard, which I had not expected to feel like mine, and which did. I want to be clear that I understood perfectly well what the situation was. I was a contract laborer from off-world, working a 2-year grounds contract that would expire at the end of winter, and the boy I spent my mornings with was the only heir of the Vithos imperial house, and the emperor who had been watching from behind a gray tendril vine was the ruler of a civilization spanning 14 inhabited worlds. I had no illusions about what I was or what category I occupied in the ordering of things on Vithos. The situation had a natural end point and I was aware of it, and I had decided early on that awareness of the end point was not a reason to withhold the mornings. You can love a season fully even knowing it will end. Marin taught me that, in a way she did not intend and would have been embarrassed to know about. The boy had started to talk to his father again. Sella told me this, with a restraint that told me it meant more than the restraint was letting on. He had spoken to the palace physician, and then, the following week, to the court's senior steward, and then, gradually, over the course of several weeks, to the emperor. Not at length. Not the way he talked in the courtyard, which was with the loose, associative freedom of someone who has forgotten to be careful. But he spoke. That was the point. He had stopped not speaking. My contract expired on the last day of deep winter. I knew it was coming. I had known since autumn, since before the courtyard, since before any of this, and I had arranged my affairs accordingly. I had told Petra, who was staying on for a second contract. I had written to Calla, who received the information with the equanimity of someone who has long since adjusted to the fact that her father moves around. I had packed my tools carefully, the way I always pack, which is to say, systematically, with each tool cleaned and wrapped and oriented the same way it had been when I took it out of the bag 2 years before. On the last morning I arrived at the courtyard early, before first light. The gate was open. I worked through the pre-dawn. There was still work to do. There is always still work to do. A garden is not a problem you solve. It is an ongoing conversation, and I did what I could in the time I had. Pruned the sections that needed pruning, aerated the beds around the winter bulbs, left detailed notes in the site log about the state of each bed, what would need attention in the spring, what the white stem plants would need in terms of their specific clay soil requirements, notes for whoever came after me. The boy arrived as the light came. He saw the packed tool bag by the gate. He stood very still for a moment. His face did the thing that Vithos faces do, but he was a child, and a child's face doesn't hide as efficiently as an adult's, and what I saw was not a diplomatic expression. It was the face of someone confronted with another leaving. "Your contract is ending," he said. "Yes," I said. He was quiet. I kept working, finishing the edge of the south bed, the last task, and he came and stood beside me, not working, just standing, which was something he had not done in weeks. In the early weeks he would stand and watch and not participate. The standing now was different from the standing then. The standing then was the distance of someone who wasn't sure whether to come closer. The standing now was the presence of someone who had already come closer and was not sure what to do with the fact of leaving. "Will you come back?" he said. I thought about this honestly. "I don't know," I said. "My contracts take me different places, but I would like to come back." I looked at the bed I had just edged. "I would like to see the white flowers." He nodded once carefully. I finished the south bed. I packed the last of my tools. I closed the site log and put it on the crate by the gate for Sella to collect. I shouldered my bag. "It has been good to work with you," I said. "You have very steady hands." He looked at his hands. "You taught me," he said. "You learned," I said. "That's different." He appeared to consider whether that distinction was meaningful. A look of brief, concentrated thought, the kind I had come to recognize as genuine engagement with a proposition rather than polite reception of it. Then he stepped forward and pressed his face briefly against my arm, the way a child does when they don't want to be seen crying, and then stepped back before I could do anything about it and stood very straight. "Safe travel, Davin Orel," he said. He used the formal Vithos farewell, and he said my full name, both names, the way the court said things when they wanted the weight of them to be felt. "Safe travel, Prince Zone," I said. And I walked out through the gate. I had my bag down at the Southwest Service gate, waiting for the ground transport that would take me to the Vithos spaceport. The morning was cold, and the sky was running its deep steel blue, and I could smell the copper in the air very clearly, the way you smell things most sharply on the last morning of a place, when the knowing that you are leaving makes the senses sharp. The transport was due in about 20 minutes. Sella Vorn came through the service gate. She walked quickly, not running, but with the specific directional certainty of someone who has been sent with a purpose and knows they have a limited amount of time to accomplish it. She stopped in front of me and looked at my bag and then at me. "The Emperor would like a word," she said. I looked at my bag. "The transport can be rescheduled," she said. We walked back through the service gate and across the outer grounds, not the way I would have walked it, taking the maintenance path, but the direct way, through the formal approach garden, which I had never walked through because it was not my jurisdiction. It was early enough that the court was not yet moving, and we had the approach garden largely to ourselves. Long pale marble paving, border plantings of the Vithos formal varieties, a fountain whose mechanism I had never understood and whose sound was very clear in the cold air. Sella left me at the entrance to the east wing. I stood in a corridor that was, by any material measure, the most expensive corridor I had ever stood in, which on Vithos means something, because Vithos doesn't do expense carelessly. The floors were pale stone with inlaid work that I am not qualified to evaluate but which I understood, in a dull and general way, to represent an enormous amount of someone's labor. The light was early morning light through very tall windows, and it ran across the floor in long pale bars, and I stood in one of them and held my bag and waited. The Emperor came alone. I had seen him at a distance, during palace ceremonies that my crew sometimes watched from the outer grounds, and once up close in the formal gardens during an inspection that had swept briefly past our section, but I had not been in the same room with him. He was taller than I remembered, with the height and the compressed bearing that the Vithos high lineages carry. And his skin was the same pale silver blue as his son's, but with the deeper saturation of adult Vithos coloring. And his eyes were large and very dark, and had the quality that eyes have when they have seen a great many things and taken account of all of them. He looked at my bag. "You are leaving," he said. "My contract has ended," I said. He was quiet for a moment. The morning light moved across the floor between us. "My son speaks now," he said. It was not quite a statement and not quite an acknowledgement. It was the kind of sentence that contains more than its words, and I waited to see whether he would say the more. "He speaks to me," the Emperor continued, "at length, about bulbs and beetles and drainage, and a lizard that escaped through a kitchen window on a space station I have never visited. A pause that had texture to it. He told me about the grub." "It was a standard soil grub," I said, "common in the clay-heavy beds." "He has decided it doesn't feel pain," the Emperor said. "He has read extensively on the subject and formed a considered view." Another pause. "He appears to have formed the view under your supervision." "He forms his own views," I said. "I just handed him the trowel." The Emperor looked at me for a long moment. His face was not unreadable. It was the face of a man exercising control over what he was showing, which is different, and what I could see around the edges of the control was something that I recognized because I have seen it in my own face, in mirrors, in the years since Marin died. The particular expression of a parent who has watched a child carry weight that was too heavy and felt their own helplessness at not being able to take it, and then felt something shift. "I was at the East Arch," he said, "a number of mornings." "I know," I said. Something in his face, not quite a smile, the Vithos equivalent. "You did not acknowledge it," he said. "It wasn't my courtyard," I said. "It was yours." He was quiet for another moment. Then, "He has asked me if you might stay." I held still. "He asked whether," the Emperor continued, "the palace grounds might have need of a head groundskeeper, on a more permanent basis." I thought about the courtyard, the winter bulbs in the ground, the white flowers that would come up in the spring, a boy who had said all right, Dad over a row of measured planting holes, and then moved on without looking back, the way you say the name of something that fits so exactly it doesn't require comment. "The outer grounds need a great deal of work," I said. "There are drainage issues in the lower terraces that my crew started on but didn't finish. The gray tendril vine on the east arch needs cutting back before the spring growth or it'll close off the arch entirely. And the nursery courtyard," I paused. "The nursery courtyard will need someone who knows the clay soil work." The Emperor looked at me for a moment. "Stay," he said. 3 words, 2 of them mine, 1 of them his. A conversation that had covered the distance it needed to cover. I set my bag down on the pale stone floor of the corridor. "I'll need to call my daughter," I said. "She'll want to know the weather." "Of course," he said. The white bulbs came up in early spring, 10 weeks later. Pale and small, the color of cloudlight, pressing up through the courtyard soil in the particular way of things that have been waiting in the dark for exactly the right conditions. The boy was there when they came. He had been checking the bed every morning for 2 weeks by then. I had given him the task of monitoring the soil temperature, which determines emergence timing, and he had been recording the measurements in a small notebook that he had begun keeping for this purpose specifically. The notebook also contained notes on the beetle classification system and some observations on the gray tendril vine that I thought were genuinely perceptive, though I had not said so yet because I was still evaluating whether they were perceptive or whether I was merely fond of the person who had written them. He crouched down at the edge of the bed and looked at the flowers for a long time. Then he looked up at me. "They're white," he said. "Yes," I said. He looked at them again. "She would have liked them," he said. "She liked white things." "Then we'll keep the bed," I said. "They'll come back next year." He nodded. He stayed crouched at the edge of the bed for another while, looking at the flowers in the pale spring light. Then he stood up, dusted his knees, and held out his hand for the trowel, because there was other work to do and the morning was not going to last forever. I handed it over. We went back to work. That is the whole story. I told you at the beginning that I was not a remarkable man, and I have told you nothing since that disproves it. I showed up. I kept showing up. I handed a child a trowel and did not make a thing of it. And the child taught himself that the soil gives back what you put into it. And somewhere in the doing of that quiet, ordinary work, in the repeated mornings, in the rhythm of the edging tool, in the questions about grubs and the conversations about carpetweed and the one afternoon when two people sat in a garden and were honest with each other about how slow grief is, something healed that I did not heal. I don't take credit for it. I handed him the trowel. He did the rest. The morning light is very good here in the spring. The sky runs to a particular blue-violet, and the copper smell in the air is lighter than in winter, and the outer grounds of the Vethil imperial residence are in good order, and my daughter calls me every third Sunday and asks about the weather, and I tell her, cold and clear, and everything is growing. That seems like enough.